Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Connecting Through Science. We're really excited to be here. I'm dietitian Diana, and I'm joined today by registered dietitian and cholesterol expert, Ashley Reaver. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Diana.
Hi. So today, I'm really excited to be talking about cholesterol. High cholesterol is a huge problem in the United States and is something that we test at InsideTracker. We have a whole host of recommendations because, we have found from our research that nutrition, exercise, supplement, lifestyle recommendations can all really make an impact on cholesterol. So today we hope to give you guys some good pointers. We hope you guys learn a little bit about cholesterol, what it is, what you can do to lower it if you do have high levels of cholesterol, and some other fun facts about cholesterol we're going to discuss today. So let's just get right to it. Why don't we start off, Ashley, by defining what cholesterol is? So what is it, and what are the different types that are commonly measured through blood tests?
Sure. So cholesterol is a waxy-like substance. Basically, it's a way to cholesterol itself is necessary for a lot of things in the body to be produced, but some very important ones in particular are your hormones. So that includes your sex hormones, as well as things related to stress, like stress hormones, but it also includes vitamin D. And the markers of cholesterol that usually get measured on a blood test are basically just different transporters of that cholesterol. So for us at InsideTracker, that includes total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. And HDL, LDL, and triglycerides are basically all different forms of how cholesterol gets carried in the body, or how fats in general get carried throughout the body.
Okay. And so I know LDL. Can you explain a little bit more about LDL versus HDL? Like what are the benefits or the pros and cons of each one?
Sure. So LDL is often what's called quote unquote bad cholesterol, and HDL is what's often referred to as good cholesterol. And basically, I kind of like to think of the difference or distinctions between the two of them of thinking of cops and robbers. So you can think of LDL, this bad cholesterol, as kind of being robbers out on the street. They are causing some havoc in the mean streets of your blood vessels. And HDL's role is really to hopefully pick up some of that cholesterol that LDL's deposited, take it back to the liver, where all cholesterol is really manufactured, so to speak, and convert it something else or help it exit the body. So LDL is typically called that bad cholesterol because it's the type of cholesterol that can increase your risk of developing heart disease, and in particular can increase the risk of developing plaques that can cause heart attacks and or strokes. So having lower levels of LDL and having higher levels of that good protective HDL is really important for helping to prevent or reduce your likelihood of developing heart disease.
Very interesting. So you would say that ratio between the two is really important as well as.
It is important. Sure. Yeah, it's definitely important. But overall, having sky high LDL is not necessarily going to be protected if you also have very high HDL. So there is an upper limit of when HDL kind of stops being protected or protective. So LDL in itself is something that really that's the number that you want to make sure is lower. And I think we'll talk about why LDL has really influences or increases your risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So having that LDL level on the lower side is definitely incredibly important. If your LDL is on the higher side, though, you also definitely want to make sure that you are increasing those good cops that are out there in the blood vessels that can help to remove some of that potentially damaging LDL.
Great. I think that's very important to clear up because I think a lot of people are told or are very focused on just the ratio, but it is, as you said, very important to also look at those individual numbers.
Yep. And we actually added a new top level to our optimal zone for HDL because there's a lot of research coming out that having an HDL level that's sky high, again, it's not necessarily protective. And often we're seeing that very high HDL coupled with a really high LDL. There is a recent rise in the number of people doing very high fat diets. And that's one of the significant contributors behind having really high levels of both of these.
Very interesting. Okay. And so, like you mentioned, high cholesterol or high LDL, to be exact, can be a major contributor to heart disease. And high cholesterol is a very common problem in the United States. Heart disease, as we both know, is the #1 killer of Americans. So, what are some of the common causes of high cholesterol?
Sure. Something that I think is so important to note is that there's 95 million adults that have higher levels of cholesterol.
Wow.
So if you have high cholesterol, know that you're not alone. I think because it's something that is like present in so many people, that's almost like a quarter or a third of the US population. It's often something that we just consider as normal, but just because it's normal doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to have an impact on your health, really. And really, there's 3 reasons behind why we have cholesterol in our body. So one, really importantly, is that our body's going to produce cholesterol regardless of what we eat, how we move our bodies. It's a required substance, again, largely for us to be able to produce a lot of those hormones. So we have a pathway in our body that produces cholesterol. And the thing that produces cholesterol is a compound that our body can choose to use as energy. So protein, fats, carbohydrates, and alcohol, they all get broken down to this thing called acetyl-CoA, which we can either put into energy producing pathways that our cells can then use for fuel, or it can also go into this HMG-CoA pathway, which is basically just taking that energy providing substance and converting that into cholesterol. So one, it's important that our body's going to make it because it's something that we do need. The second reason that you can have high LDL levels in particular is if you have a diet that's very high in saturated fats or is high in man-made trans fats, which have been outlawed from manufactured food for the most part, but you can still certainly find them in some things. And that saturated fat is such an important component because while it doesn't necessarily change the rate at which we make cholesterol, it results in a lot more of these very small, dense LDL particles. So when our body releases cholesterol from the liver, it starts as a very large, very low density lipoprotein. So it's a really large molecule that has a lot of fat and a lot of cholesterol in it. Then it goes down to something called an intermediate density lipoprotein, and then eventually down to LDL, which stands for low density lipoprotein. And again, that LDL is just a way that we can transport cholesterol through the body. But if you have a diet that's very high in saturated fat, that LDL continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So it keeps delivering fat or triglycerides to cells in your body, but it remains in this smaller, denser form for a longer period of time. And that small, dense LDL is really the type of LDL that's the most dangerous, that has the greatest likelihood of leading to some of these aspects that are related to heart disease. So saturated fats in particular are largely associated with an increase in the amount of these LDL particles that kind of linger for a much longer period of time. So saturated fat is really the second point there for cholesterol being high. And the third one is that we don't necessarily have any way to get cholesterol out of our body. We can use it for producing those compounds in our body that require cholesterol as an essential building block. And really, that's it. Cholesterol is just going to stay there and continue to accumulate until our body needs it in pretty small amounts. One of the compounds that we require cholesterol in order to make is bile. And bile is a digestive compound that is necessary for us to be able to break down and digest fats. And focusing on bile is really the best way to increase your body's utilization of cholesterol. In particular, diets that are very high in soluble fiber are a very important thing to have in order to remove a lot of this excess bile from our body. So if you eat something that's high in soluble fiber, essentially in your small intestines where bile is excreted and gets mixed with whatever food components are there, it can bind to this soluble fiber and get transported out of the body. Since we need that bile in order to be able to absorb fats, the body has to produce more of it. And it does that by pulling on our cholesterol stores. And that pathway is really the only way you can consistently be removing cholesterol in the form of bile from your body. So again, cholesterol is largely going to be something that's present in every person, regardless of what they eat, because our body produces it. Eating high saturated fats can make that LDL level in particular be high because those LDL are lingering around for a lot longer. And then if you don't have a high amount of soluble fiber in your diet, you don't really have a way of removing cholesterol, and it can just accumulate in your system.
Awesome explanation. This is why you
that was wordy.
Well, that was really interesting, and I love the biochemistry aspect to it as well. I think it's important to understand those different mechanisms. So for people who don't know where saturated fat comes from, where is it presently found in the diet?
Yeah, so overwhelmingly, you're going to find saturated fat in animal products. Every fat, well, I won't say every, but a vast majority of fat that you're going to find in animal products is going to be a saturated fat. So animal products that are much fattier or are only fat coming from animal products are going to have a very high percentage of those fats being saturated. In the US diet, that largely is going to come in the form of red meat, butter, and cream. But you can also find saturated fats in plants. So the three plants that have the pretty high ratios of saturated fat are coconut oil, or coconuts, palm oil, and then also cocoa butter. Just because it's from a plant doesn't necessarily mean it's great. I think the person that marketed coconut oil as a health food should be the richest, most sought after marketer out there. The types of fats that you find in coconut oil are the same types of fats that you're going to find in butter or red meat. And it's not necessary to completely cut them out, but you shouldn't necessarily be eating coconut oil in very large amounts because you think it's a superfood that's really good for your health. Typically it's going to be in those three plant foods, and it's also going to be in the vast majority of animal products unless they've been manipulated in some way to remove all of the fat from them.
And because you mentioned it, and I've talked to a lot of people who've had this question for me, so I'm going to ask you to give your viewpoint too. Can you just talk a little bit about this whole coconut oil or butter trend that's happening right now that people put into their coffee and make bulletproof coffee? Like, what does what do you think about this trend? Should people be doing it? I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Personally, I don't think that you need to put butter in your coffee. It's great. You should be giving yourself some energy in the morning. There's studies that were just released that having food before you have coffee is something that can be helpful for preventing insulin resistance and for your glucose metabolism. However, there's a lot of better food choices you can make for yourself than butter in your morning coffee. I honestly don't get it. The guy that made it up made a lot of money on it. So I feel like that's why there was a lot of people that adhered to it. It's because with a lot of money, he had a lot of marketing power.
Yeah.
You would be better served probably not to put butter in your coffee and just eat breakfast, and even better have some water before you drink coffee or eat breakfast.
Yeah, there we go. And a lot of people think that coconut oil is a healthier alternative to butter in their coffee, but it really isn't. And a lot of studies do show that coconut oil will increase your LDL. And while it does, a lot of people say it has great benefits because it can improve HDL, you also need to understand there is a risk that it will increase that LDL or bad cholesterol.
Yeah, and I'll say that it got super popular because it contains medium chain triglycerides, or MCT, or those MCT oils that now you can find at every drugstore or grocery store. And while coconut oil does contain them, it doesn't contain only them. It contains much more of these saturated fats. So if you want to get the benefits of medium chain triglycerides in isolation, you have to buy it in supplement form. Because what you're actually getting in coconut oil is a lot more of that saturated fat.
Yes. So if you have high cholesterol, guys, what we just mentioned, saturated fat, coconut oil, lack of fiber in your diet, all can be a cause for this high cholesterol. So let's just talk about what are some of the most effective ways to actually reduce LDL cholesterol, so this bad cholesterol.
Sure. So that's largely going to focus on those two factors of trying to cut back on the amount of saturated fat as well as increase the amount of fiber, and in particular soluble fiber. And I'll start on fiber because that one I think requires a little more explanation. So fiber, it really exists in two forms. The first one, soluble fiber, is named soluble because it can swell, or you can think of it also as being able to dissolve in water. And that ability for it to swell makes it super sticky, basically, is like how I like to think about it. It has great impacts for how your body is able to manage glucose that gets released after a meal, but also in particular, that soluble fiber is what is really traps a lot of that bile. You can think of it as like driving a little smart car or a Mini Cooper into your small intestines and trying to pick up a lot of bile. If you're picking it up in a soluble fiber, that's like a massive van that you can pack 16 people into versus a 2-seater. So that soluble fiber that you get is really what's most important for binding to that bile in your small intestines and trying to transport a lot of it out. The best sources of soluble fiber are always going to be sources of whole grains. In particular, oatmeal and barley. They have a particular type of soluble fiber called beta glucan that just happens to be like the stickiest. So those two foods are going to have a really big impact. But any type of whole grain meaning that the fibrous portion hasn't been removed. So that would include brown rice. Certainly can be whole wheat bread, whole wheat pastas, quinoa, farro. There's all sorts of examples like that. Chia seeds and flaxseed also contain some of that soluble fiber. Honestly, if everyone ate a bowl of oatmeal every day, pharmaceutical companies would be way worse off because a lot of people would not require these statin medications in particular. Eating a bowl of oatmeal can be just as effective for lowering cholesterol levels if your levels aren't that high. So that's a great kind of like prophylactic way of not ending up requiring some sort of medication when you can do it through a 5-cent bowl of oatmeal in the morning.
And not to mention, if you replace that oatmeal with eggs, or you replace the eggs with oatmeal, you're also reducing the saturated fat in your diet. So you're doing two methods to help you reduce your LDL cholesterol.
Yeah, definitely. And the second one, again, is trying to cut back on that saturated fat that you have. Studies are very, very strong showing that if you are replacing a source of saturated fat with a good source of fiber, so another great swap would be like removing animal protein from a meal and instead having edamame or beans, that's where you're going to get the biggest impact because you're reducing the thing that causes an increase and you're increasing the thing that causes a decrease. And certainly if you could remove all saturated fat, that would probably be the best route. But if it's not something that is realistic and like you don't think that you could completely eliminate that, you can still cut it back in a way that you don't feel restricted, and you can still have a big impact on your cholesterol levels.
Awesome. Okay, great. And so let's say someone has a family history of high cholesterol, and it's kind of runs in their family, it's in their genetics. Can you still lower high cholesterol? Do they still have a chance of lowering high cholesterol? Is there something extra they should be doing? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so family history includes a lot of stuff. One component of family history could be genetics, but I think people often overlook that you also inherit your favorite foods, your eating pattern, how you cook your foods, what you add to your foods, the like hobbies that you have, the way you move your body. All of those things have just as much of an impact for most people. There is a study that came out of Europe that said that 90% of people that have elevated cholesterol do not have genes that are related to higher levels of cholesterol. So for 90% of people, so let's say 90% of the 95 million people in the United States, their cholesterol is high due to all of these other factors, not just for that genetic reason. So for the vast majority of people, making changes to diet and lifestyle is enough to see an improvement in those cholesterol levels, in particular if you can make those changes early on, before your levels rise too high. That being said, there are certainly genetic factors that also play a big role. In particular, the most researched genetic factors impact the cholesterol pathway two places. So the first one is if there's no feedback mechanism, or there's some sort of error in the feedback mechanism that your body has to stop producing cholesterol. So for a lot of people, once our cholesterol levels reach a certain level, it sends a signal to our body to stop producing cholesterol. So one factor of a genetic issue could be that that feedback process has just been interrupted. The other one is that LDL isn't removed from the body as regularly or as efficiently. And when I say removed in that sense, I'm not necessarily talking about leaving through soluble fiber, but that it is being basically reabsorbed into our liver, or into some of our cells, and is able to come out of circulation that way. So if that is a genetic component which you can test, I would strongly encourage, if you think that there's a family history or genetic component, you can get an answer to that. If you have inherited from just one parent, kind of one of those traits, then you can still make changes through lifestyle. You're just going to have to try a lot harder. You're going to need to be much more diligent. If you've inherited it from both parents, though, there's a very strong likelihood that you're going to need some sort of pharmaceutical in order to help bring that level down. And honestly, that's great that medical research has developed this thing that can drastically decrease the risk of someone that does have genetically high levels of cholesterol. Can drastically reduce that level in their body, and therefore have a big impact on their risk of developing heart disease as well.
Great. Yeah. So I think that's really important to note that, wow, you said 90% of people. That's incredible.
Yep. The vast majority of people, there isn't a genetic component to it. And I hear from people all the time, well, I have to go on this because my brother, 4 of my 6 siblings are already on this.
Yeah.
But 4 of your 6 siblings probably eat the exact same way that you do
Right.
as
Exactly.
well. So it's important to really be honest and take stock in your diet. Are there areas that you can improve on your diet that honestly you could share with your siblings as well?
Yeah.
That would also help to lower those LDL levels that have nothing to do with inheriting certain genes.
Yeah. And yeah, that's really interesting. And at InsideTracker, if you do suspect you may have that genetic predisposition to have high cholesterol, we do offer a DNA kit at InsideTracker that does test it, and we also have that the blood work that you can do along with that. So if you do suspect it, you can get it done through us, and we do offer you those specific nutrition and lifestyle recommendations to lower it.
I would always recommend if that's what you think, then you should get it tested so that you know.
Right.
Don't stress yourself out about things that you can get an answer to.
Exactly.
And it's great that there's an option to do that.
Yeah. And so real quick, let's just touch upon how stress and exercise plays a role into cholesterol, because we haven't really talked about that at all.
Sure. So exercise can have an influence. Basically, if you go back to what we talked about at the beginning, that building block for energy is also the building block for cholesterol. So if you are requiring more energy because you're exercising, that could lead to a lower production in cholesterol, because that building block is now being used for fuel as opposed to going into cholesterol production. More so, though, there is a strong association between exercise and LDL levels, so helping to boost that good LDL. Exercise in particular, as it relates to your blood pressure, though, is also something that's really important to think about overall heart health, which kind of ties hand in hand with stress. So those things stress doesn't necessarily have any impact on your cholesterol level. Theoretically, maybe you could produce less if you're stressed out, because being stressed requires a lot of energy. Your body systems need a lot of energy to sustain a stressed out state. But one thing that stress also does is that it constricts our blood vessels. which can increase our blood pressure. And high levels of HDL coupled with higher levels of blood pressure is really increases your risk of that heart disease. One thing that we haven't talked about yet, but why LDL is so tightly linked to heart disease is because too much LDL basically results in inflammation in our body. And that inflammation it basically kicks up our immune system. So white blood cells are being released, and they essentially try and eat or trap excess levels of LDL that are floating in our system. And then they adhere themselves to the lining of our blood vessels. After they've taken in so many LDL, they eventually die. And then another white blood cell comes along and attaches itself there. And this basically accumulation of dying white blood cells, because they've taken in so much of this LDL, is what leads to plaque formation, and plaque is what leads to kind of the narrowing of the arteries. So if you are coupling that process because there's higher levels of HDL, perhaps there's also higher levels of inflammation, which can come from a lot of things. If you have higher levels of blood pressure as well, you're pushing, actually think about it as pushing so much pressure or needing a lot of force to move blood through your blood vessels. And that can increase the risk of breaking one of those plaques off, where it can travel somewhere else and block a smaller blood vessel. So stress itself doesn't necessarily have a big impact on just your body's production of cholesterol, but it can increase the risk of higher levels of cholesterol being more dangerous.
Okay, that's really important, because I do feel like especially of late, there's a lot of people out there who are very skeptical about high LDL cholesterol leading to heart disease. And I mean, we've learned, and there's just so much evidence in science to show that yes, high LDL cholesterol really does result in heart disease. Like, why are people so skeptical about this connection when there is so much evidence to show that this is the case? Like, why?
Yeah, I would say you're not going to find those people in the medical field. You're also not going to find them in scientific research. You might find them in the meat aisle, but there is no person that is responsible for someone else's health that thinks that having high levels of LDL is a good thing or something that we don't need to worry about. There is an insane amount of evidence that LDL itself is an independent risk factor of developing cardiovascular disease. Yes, that risk is going to increase if you smoke, if you have high blood pressure, if you're overweight, if you don't exercise, if you have other sources of inflammation, if you have diabetes. But LDL on its own, without all of those other factors, is still an independent risk factor for LDL. And while it's okay if someone chooses to make their own health decisions ignoring LDL, it is not something that anyone that is actually responsible for making sure people live longer lives is going to prescribe or adhere to at all. So the medical field and scientific research is crystal clear on the impact of LDL and the development of heart disease, and then potentially the development of a heart attack or a stroke. So again, you're not going to find those. I would imagine they're probably the same people that put butter in their coffee. Not necessarily, again, a view that's at all held by people that have other people's health, actually within their hands.
Great. I'm glad we could clear that up. That's straight from dietitian, master's in nutrition science, expert in cholesterol. Okay, great. And just to kind of wrap it up, what is the recommended amount of time people should wait to recheck or retest their cholesterol levels?
Yeah, so honestly, I always recommend 3 months. There are some studies that you may be able to see an impact in 6 weeks. But blood tests are expensive, and they're not necessarily most people do for fun. Some people that work at InsideTracker definitely do them for fun. But 3 months is a great time to check in. And that's honestly something that I really, really encourage people to do. Put a date 3 months from now on your calendar if you're going to start working on your cholesterol today. And that's because you're going to get feedback that what you're doing is actually making a difference. Cholesterol isn't something that you see, you can't feel it. You don't get to stand on a scale and see if what you're doing is making a difference. And without that feedback, that's often why people might be really gung-ho after they leave the doctor's appointment or a doctor's appointment one year, maybe they do really well for a few weeks, but they get no feedback that what they're doing is working. So then by the time they get to their doctor's office the next year, they've abandoned doing whatever they thought they were supposed to be doing because they haven't gotten any sort of reinforcement that their behaviors have been impactful. So every 3 months, just for your lipid levels, I think is a really great check-in. You should see some movement in 3 months to let you know that the intervention or the change that you've decided to make is having an impact. And that can really, be inspiration to keep going forward, or it can also provide feedback that maybe the changes that you made weren't the right ones for your body.
Great, yeah. And just a reminder, we do, our blood tests do include all of that the lipid panel, which includes all the cholesterol markers that Ashley talked about. Okay, so a few key takeaways. What are 3 or 4 takeaways that people can take away from this talk?
Yeah, one, I would say eat your soluble fiber. Even if you decide not to change the saturated fat content of your diet, increasing your soluble fiber is going to help to pull that cholesterol out of your body and help to lower it. Seriously,
when you had mentioned oats before, is there a specific type of oats? Because I know this does come up a lot in conversation.
Yeah, good point. So there's 3 main types of oats that you're going to find: steel cut oats, rolled oats, and instant oats. Steel cut oats and rolled oats are really the 2 that you'd want to go for. Rolled oats are basically just steamed steel cut oats that have been rolled, that have been flattened to increase their surface area so that they cook faster. Same amount of fiber that you'd find in steel cut oats, but it doesn't take you 35 minutes. You can make it in the microwave in 2 minutes. Instant oats, on the other hand, those are the ones that are okay to have occasionally, but that shouldn't be where you put all of your oat effort, I'll say. And that's because they have had some of that fiber removed so that they cook up so much faster. So my vote's going to be rolled oats because it doesn't have a big time commitment, and it has just as much of that soluble fiber that's beneficial as more difficult steel cut oats.
Okay, great. And sorry, the last 2 takeaways?
Second one would be look at the saturated fat content of your diet. That does not mean that you have to absolutely cut out all sources of saturated fat in your diet in order to improve your cholesterol levels. But that is something that you really should consider. And one thing that I would definitely encourage is starting with your meat intake. If you eat meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day, a great first step to try and cut that back would be trying to remove it just from breakfast. So now you've brought that meat intake down from 21 times a week down to 14. Maybe a next step would be to drop it down to 10, then to 7, then to 4. Make really small incremental changes in those, I like to call them high saturated fat ticket foods, those really big ticket foods. That's where you're going to also see a lot of that impact. And maybe the third one, just ending on our last point that we talked about, is you should take it seriously. Follow people that are experts in heart health, or I would say that one. If you have been indoctrinated with the notion that saturated fat is awesome for you and you don't have to look at your LDL number, I would encourage you to diversify the people that you are getting your health information from. Nothing is okay in scarcity or in an extreme. Health really does lay in kind of that gray area of moderation, which isn't sexy and it doesn't sell books or products, but honestly, be getting your health information from a wide variety of people, not only people that are supporting the opinions that you also hold.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to end this episode. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about cholesterol, Ashley. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I even learned a ton about cholesterol.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye.